Hey everyone, welcome to session 115 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. You've more than likely heard the saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Well, in the third installment of the Inside JABA Series, Dr. Iser DeLeon joins us, and along with Inside JABA regulars Drs. Tiger and St. Peter, they do a deep dive into this topic of accumulated versus distributed reinforcement to see if this adage really holds true in the context of skill acquisition and problem behavior. I'm really excited to have Dr. DeLeon, better known as Willie to friends and colleagues, on the show. Willie's contributions to the field are too lengthy to list here, but to summarize, he is a professor of psychology at the University of Florida, and he's done great work in the area of translating concepts derived from the experimental analysis of behavior for use in the applied realm. I'll read you a little bit from his bio here. Willie's work is notable for its use of concepts derived from behavioral economics, behavioral momentum, and other conceptual models as they apply to behavior analytic interventions. In addition to his impressive research and scholarly contributions, Dr. DeLeon has served on the editorial boards of a number of behavior analysis journals, including as associate editor of JABA and editor of translational research for the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. So as you can see, Willie, along with my other Inside JABA co-hosts, are eminently qualified to talk about this subject. In this episode, we reference 3 different papers on distributed versus accumulated reinforcement. During our conversation, just for the sake of convenience, I referred to them as Willie's paper, Claire's paper, Jeff's paper, and so on. Obviously, these are team efforts, so I'd like to take a minute here to give full and proper recognition to all the authors on the paper. So, the papers we discussed are as follows. DeLeon, Chase, Frank Crawford, Carew, Webster, Triggs, Bullock, and Jennett, 2014. Distributed and Accumulated Reinforcement Arrangements, Evaluations of Efficacy and Preference. The next paper is Fulton, Tiger, Meitzen, and Efforts, 2019. A comparison of accumulated and distributed reinforcement periods with children exhibiting escape-maintain problem behavior. And lastly, Robinson and St. Peter, 2019. Accumulated reinforcers increase academic responding and suppress problem behavior for students with ADHD. All right, I feel like Rob from ABA Inside Track. Anyway, during our chat, a number of other papers came up, and you can find those specific references over at behavioralobservations.com. As with the previous Inside JABA Series podcast, there are no ads or sponsors during these shows, but the content is eligible for continuing education credit. And as a reminder, 50% of the proceeds from the sales of these CE events go towards supporting the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. So if you want to support what we're doing here, please go to behavioralobservations.com/getCEUs. Once there, you'll also be able to see other podcasts that are eligible for continuing ed, and discounts are available for bulk purchases. Lastly, we recorded this episode during the second week of the COVID-19 quarantine, so I choose to use cabin fever as an excuse, as I think I referred to this podcast as the 4th, not 3rd installment of the Inside JABA series. So I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this in-depth conversation about accumulated and distributed reinforcement.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, this is the 3rd edition of the Inside JABA series. I am joined by Drs. Tiger and St. Peter. We have a special guest today, Dr. Iser DeLeon, better known as Willie to friends and colleagues. I want to welcome you all today in this kind of work from home edition of Inside JABA. How's everyone doing?
Great, Matt. Thank you so much for hosting us again.
Yeah. And as you say, working from home.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So we, this is a great idea from Claire and Jeff. And they invited Willie to come along with us to talk about the concept or the differences between accumulated versus distributed reinforcers. And so this discussion is going to span, at the very least, 3 articles, and we'll list those articles in the show notes. that were contributed to by all three of our guests here today. And I'm sure we'll probably mention other articles as we go along as well. We'll do our best to get those to get those references in the show notes. But this is a really interesting topic. So anyone who's working with kids who work for reinforcers, meaning that most people in the world of applied behavior analysis at some point or another, who are concerned about cooperation, who are concerned with problem behaviors and just staying on task and things like that, will have some interest in this. And one of the things I like about this is a really nice topic that spans both the experimental and the applied literature, even though these are all applied renderings, I guess, of these concepts. So without any further delay, I'd like to just kind of get into this. One of the things I want to do to get started here is that we're going to introduce a bunch of new terms, and we're going to kind of use, Willie, your DeLeon 2014 paper in Java as the kind of stepping stone for this. So I'm going to leave it up to you to decide what we want to do first, meaning that what I'd like to do is that, do you want to talk about introducing some of these terms first, like accumulated, what's the difference between accumulated versus distributed reinforcers, unit price, reinforcer for efficacy, etc., or do you want to just kind of explain what those things are in the course of laying out the goals and objectives and the findings of your paper?
Well, I suppose it'd be useful to sort of set our terms first. The distinction between accumulated and distributed is fairly simple, and we tended to do this. What, in retrospect, to me now seems like an odd thing in a lot of our research is give kids 30 seconds access to a preferred activity as a reinforcer. And just in terms of watching this operate with many of the kids that I work with, it just seemed like a weird thing to do. It's like, well, who wants 30 seconds access to their favorite video? So what we started to consider is whether they wouldn't want it to be delivered to them more continuously through time. So that's really what we mean by accumulated. Rather than getting 30 seconds access to a reinforcer after completion of one or a small number of responses, you in essence bank the number of reinforcers you've earned, complete all the work first, and then get continuous, uninterrupted access to all the reinforcers that you've earned at once. And that we compared that to what we call the distributed condition, which is simply the more conventional sort of operation in which the kid completes the response, gets 30 seconds, completes another response, gets 30 seconds, and so forth. So that was, I don't know that we landed upon the best terms for that. Other people have been doing this kind of work, and they called it different sorts of things, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. But that's essentially the distinction that we're trying to draw out there. Other terms that you think are important to define, you mentioned unit price. Unit price is simply the amount of work, in this case, required to earn 1 unit of the reinforcer. So if you earn, 30 seconds of access to a video for 5 responses, the unit price is 5 responses. But unit price is a really important concept in this work, at least I think, because in all the studies, we try hard to keep the unit price constant. That is, you don't want to let the amount of work that an individual has to do to earn a given unit of the reinforcer vary, because if you get differences between arrangements, then it's difficult to say whether it's a function of the procedural differences between the two arrangements, or whether one actually resulted in a different unit price such that it was more beneficial to operate under those conditions than the other. Right? So in all of the studies, we try very hard to make sure that no matter whether you're working in a distributed or accumulated fashion, the amount of work you have to do for a given reinforcer remains the same.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And I think some of the other things that you mentioned are simple enough. Reinforcer efficacy, that can mean several things. And in many of our studies, it tends to be some kind of metric of the potency, the effectiveness of the reinforcer. I tend to use certain terms interchangeably in a manner that I shouldn't. For example, I often talk about stimulus value, which is a total construct. There's no independent stimulus value, but it's a useful shorthand. It's a useful heuristic for simply getting across the idea of how much is something worth, how valuable is it to a given child. So usually efficacy is measured, across these studies, is measured in terms of response rates. If one reinforcer produces faster rates of responding, sometimes it's measured in terms of choice, sometimes it's measured in other things. I've tended to use more recently things like progressive ratio schedules or demand curves, which are a different kind of metric of reinforcer efficacy. I'm staying away from rate. Rate, I think, is a bad measure, despite the fact that in this 2014 study, rate is what we used for reinforcer efficacy. But I think rate as a measure of relative reinforcement effects has lots of problems.
Okay. If we have time, I wouldn't mind coming back to that. But for the time being, so let's talk about the study itself. What were you? So you're looking at the difference between responding with accumulated and distributed reinforcers, and then you did a very interesting kind of a preference assessment. And there were two studies in the paper. So if you can maybe start off by giving us a walkthrough of what were the basic experimental questions. And then how did you attempt to answer those questions through the study itself?
Right. Well, so the 2014 paper had two experiments. The first one was an assessment of reinforcer efficacy between these two arrangements, between the distributed and accumulated reinforcement conditions. And it's simple design. It's just A-B, where A is a no reinforcement baseline and B was a multi-element comparison of the two different conditions, of the accumulated and distributed conditions. So we'd bring the child into the session. We'd provide a verbal description and a single prompt to complete the work. And these were free operant tasks. That is, not in a discrete trial format, but things that the child is free to do at their own rate, and that's why we ended up measuring rate as our metric of reinforcer efficacy. In the baseline condition, there's no program consequences, and then in the multi-element comparison of the two treatment conditions, in the distributed condition, it was 30 seconds access to a chosen reinforcer on an FR1 schedule, and that remain in effect until 10 reinforcers were earned. Now, we had carefully selected the reinforcers that were using this because initially our questions were really about differences in potential differences as a function of the class of reinforcer. So we had done a whole bunch of prior research loosely based on determinants of stimulus value. What makes something valuable to a child? So we're looking at things like delay and the relationship between effort and value, substitutability effects, and so forth. And we thought that this might be one of the issues, but we thought there would be more of an issue with the kind of reinforcers that I think the way we stated it was that may have their value enhanced by continuity. That is, they're more valuable to the individual if they can hang on to that reinforcer for a longer period of time. And we thought that some reinforcers kind of lend themselves to that distinction. Something like a video game, right? You don't want 30 seconds of a video game. You want to play until your guy dies, right? Or you don't want 30 seconds of access to a puzzle. You want to finish the puzzle, right? That's what the real reinforcer is. So we had selected the reinforcers before that study, thinking that they were the sort of things that had that quality. They would be enhanced through continuity. So we used things like puzzles and videos or video games, things like that. So in one condition, a distributed condition, we gave them 30 seconds access for completion of tasks on an FR1 schedule. In the accumulated condition, we started with delivering of tokens, right? So rather than getting the reinforcer itself, the child would get a token, but then those tokens were exchangeable at the end of sessions for the accumulated amount of time with that reinforcer. And this, that first study was just a simple A-B arrangement between the two conditions. In the accumulated one, the tokens were still given on an FR1 schedule, but they were traded in on an FR10 exchange schedule. So the child had to earn 10 tokens in order to be able to exchange. exchange production schedule, rather, I should say, for an accumulator or continuous 5-minute access. And we simply measured response rates under those two conditions. What we were really looking for was, what we thought was going to happen was that the accumulated condition will result in a lower response rate. That is, we thought it would be impacted by the fact that in the accumulated condition, you don't get access to the reinforcer until you've completed all the work, which introduces a delay to contact with the reinforcer. So we thought that delay would sort of diminish the stimulus value. So we were just looking to see how much of an impact it would have, but that's not what we found at all. What we found was, in fact, there were some inconsistencies in that study between the two treatment phases, inconsistent reinforcement effects. But on average, what we saw was that the accumulated condition actually produced higher response rates than the more conventional distributed condition.
Yeah, I'm looking at Figure 1 right now, and I'll cut and paste that in the show notes for this episode, and that's certainly apparent, especially with some of the participants.
Yeah, so if you look at that figure, you can see that, across the two B phases, the results aren't always consistent. For example, in one B phase, you see a clear higher level of responding for the accumulated condition, but then when we reverse back to it, you see no difference. But in no case was the accumulated condition resulting in response rates that were lower than the distributed condition. So having done that, we found that, it wasn't in fact lower in accumulated. In fact, it was on average higher.
Willie, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what was it, were you guys getting these, as you were getting these data in, can you tell me what it was like, or because it sounded like you from what you said, you got the opposite of what you had expected. And for perhaps to provide listeners who are, the lion's share, everyday practitioners who don't have this kind of discovery type of moment, if you will, that folks in the research community do. Can you tell me what it was? Were you guys like, are these data correct? Or what was the response of those involved in the collection of this information, and the analysis of it? Were you guys like, holy crap, what the hell is going on here? Or tell us a little bit about that.
No, I think, honestly, it was a pleasant surprise. We weren't sure what we were going to get. It was a shot in the dark. We were pretty confident that we were going to get preferences for the accumulated condition, what we did in the second study, but we weren't expecting the response rates to be higher as well. So when those data started rolling in, we're like, well, this is cool. It's not just lower; it's in fact higher. We were expecting a detriment. So now we had further weaponry to make a case for, hey, maybe we should be considering these sorts of arrangements as well. Jeff, did you raise a finger there? Or?
Yeah, I just wanted to say it was what got me so interested in this line of research. And in so many ways, it was so counterintuitive, is that you're setting up an arrangement where, you have a choice between an immediate small amount of reinforcement or a delayed to a much larger amount of reinforcement. And so much of the literature suggests, especially working with the population, that you're much more likely to get selections of that impulsive, smaller, sooner reward choice. So to see kids and kind of voluntarily delaying access to a reinforcer really spoke to their especially because you controlled unit price, that there really did seem to be something much more valuable about this condition. To have this voluntary delay in order to access it was really surprising, counterintuitive, and that's what got me so excited about this area.
Yeah, and it was that the effects of, or what we thought would be the effects of that delay that kind of surprised us, because we thought surely it would tank because kids want their stuff right away, right? Like, no, they were perfectly willing to wait, Actually, the real surprise, I think the greater surprise, I should say, came in the second study, because, again, we thought initially this was a study about different reinforcer classes, and we thought we'd find differences between, say, edible reinforcers and activities, which we did not. But, I'll get back to that later. But anyway, so, we found higher response rates on average for the accumulated condition, and our real questions, or the ones that capture our attention most, at least initially, were about preference. Because we had seen, a couple of studies, there's, I think everybody in everybody's paper, the Jody Steinhilber and Camry Johnson paper was mentioned, showing that, hey, you get different preference hierarchies depending on how long you give a kid access to a reinforcer, which was, influential in our thinking about this. And I had come in contact with other things. I think one of the studies that I cited in there was Hackenberg and Cindy Pietra's paper on the nature of video, the qualitative nature of video as a reinforcer, perhaps being enhanced through continuity. And I think that's where we got the term continuity, the one that we stuck with ultimately. So, yeah, in that second study, we're just like, all right, now we know this one kind of works a little bit better, at least for these kids. Let's look at which one the kids prefer, with the notion being that perhaps kids would do better under conditions in which they prefer to operate. So that was, again, fairly simple. We used a concurrent chain schedule. So at the beginning of a session, a child would get, would see two stimuli, right? And if you choose A, you get to work under this condition. And if you choose B, you get to work under this condition. And simply what we're measuring is which one do they choose more often, A or B? And of course, in those two cases, one condition was distributed, one condition was accumulated. So we're just looking at the distribution of what we call the initial link selections, right? What's the first part of those chains? We set up the second experiment in something that was closer to a discrete trial, the type of discrete trial training, in the sense that these were, tasks that we prompted the kids to complete rather than a simple free operant test, just so that it seemed, a bit closer to the actual things that one might do in practice when working with such a child. And so across a variety of conditions like that, we manipulated several things, but in every case, we were just asking which way would the kid prefer to work. And the first kid that we ran through that procedure kind of showed us what we thought we'd get. That is, that first child showed ultimately a very clear preference for the accumulated condition when it was an activity reinforcer, when it was something that the kid was able to do. But then we switched to kind of reinforcers and we started throwing food in there because we didn't think food had that quality. We was like, well, why do you want to accumulate food? Food is just as good consumed a little bit of the time as, or at least we thought, as it is consumed all at once. And that child showed us something more akin to indifference when the reinforcer was an edible item. He would sometimes select one, sometimes select the other with no clear pattern. But that was the only kid that showed us that pattern. All of the three other participants in that study showed us a preference for the accumulated condition, independent of what the reinforcer was, regardless of whether it was an activity or a food item. And in some cases, we made these odd manipulations, honestly, just an attempt to push the kid off a preference for the distributed condition. So we did these odd manipulations with I think we called them like longer exchange delays or something like that.
LEDs.
LEDs. Just to make sure that the reason that they were choosing the distributed or the accumulated reinforcer wasn't because, there wasn't really much of a temporal distance. Again, we thought the initial factor would be delay to the first contact with the reinforcer. But when you looked at what the kids were actually doing, there was only a few number of trials that the kid had to complete, and the actual absolute delay was only on the order of like a minute and a half. So we thought, well, maybe that's just not enough time for the kids to really feel the burden of having to wait for that reinforcer. So we introduced those LEDs to make it a larger absolute difference. But in one case, it kind of made a difference. But then even when we took out those LEDs, the preferences remained the same. And the other individuals, it didn't matter. They still wanted the accumulated reinforcer, even when it was food. So that was the surprise to us. Because we thought, again, we were looking for differences in classes of reinforcers, and we weren't really finding them consistently anyway.
So Willie, with regard to the edibles, that's certainly intriguing because you're right. It doesn't. You'd think, okay, you can, sometimes we differentiate in practice between like a consumable reinforcer that's there and gone versus something that takes time to do, and much along the way, same way that you've described here. And can you tell the listeners a little bit about some of the edibles and how, what were the difference between, so is it like, were they earning like one or two small pieces of edibles versus maybe like a bag of chips or something like that, a small bag of chips towards the, so can you lay out the distinction in terms of what they were accumulating in the edible?
Willie, was it this study where they were stacking the gummy bears?
Yeah. So that raises a really interesting question. These were very conventional things. Some kid was earning a Skittle, and it would be just one Skittle. In a distributed condition, you complete one response, you get one Skittle. And in the accumulated condition, you complete 10 responses, and you get 10 at a time. Well, for some of the kids, for example, what we later figured out is that if you give some kids 10 Skittles, they don't just have 10 bits of food. Now they have a toy, and they can mix and match according to color and play with it for a while. So it kind of, in accumulating the reinforcers, it kind of took on a qualitative rather than simply a quantitative difference. There's different things that you can do with it. So we were scratching our heads and we were looking for explanations like that, which was really interesting. The kids always surprise you and you always learn new things from them. But I think for some other kids, though, one of the things that we considered in the course of running this experiment is maybe the case that it's not just that more is better. More is often better. Larger magnitude reinforcers are often better than smaller magnitude reinforcers. But for some classes of stimuli, perhaps what you're looking at is what we might call optimal unit size. That is, what is the right size of this reinforcer to consume optimally? So one Skittle is perhaps not the optimal unit size. When you eat some Skittles, what you probably do is pour a handful into your hand and you eat about 10 at a time. So maybe it's a function of differences in the quality of the reinforcer. It's a function of what you are accustomed to eating and how you're accustomed to eating it. I have to credit my co-author. Go ahead, Claire.
When I teach this stuff, I often talk about this as a Goldilocks problem, right? Like, so too little is not good and too much is probably not good. And there's somewhere in the middle that's like just right. So like one Skittle might not be great. You might not also want to eat a 4-pound bag of Skittles in one sitting, but a handful might be just right. So there probably are some of these magnitude manipulations where that vary from not just reinforcer class to reinforcer class, but also from reinforcer to reinforcer. I mean, even within a class, right? The amount of Skittles that you might want versus chips versus cookies may differ. And it's probably not on the level of the calorie that I don't know that we've really nailed down yet as a science.
Yeah. I was going to say, beyond just a class of reinforcers, I've often thought that there's probably for everything, there's a critical magnitude at which that does or does not function as a reinforcer. So one Skittle may function as a reinforcer, but if like you shaved it down, like one fleck of Skittle dust is not going to serve as a reinforcer. There's a certain amount of accumulation before that individually will. And a video, it might be 15 seconds, it might be 30 seconds. It may just be that for that particular reinforcer, it requires a larger magnitude before it will start to function as a reinforcer.
Yeah, that's exactly true. In fact, I've got one kid that we work with here that we were involving in a study that required us to ensure before the study procedures that the child was sensitive to magnitude effects. And so we did, those kinds of comparisons. What we were trying to do was determine at what point does the child even discern a difference in the magnitude. Is it 1 versus 2 or 1 versus 3 or 1 versus 4? How big does the larger magnitude have to become before the child clearly chooses that one? And we had one really interesting child that always chose the 1, regardless of how large the other one got. Well, I think it's exactly what you described, Jeff, because it's not that she wasn't sensitive to magnitude effects, it's that one is the right size for that particular reinforcer. Because then when we subsequently went back to say, what if we moved in the other direction? What if we moved from 1 versus 1/2 or 1 versus 1/4? She's still stuck with the 1. So 1 was just the right size, and it wasn't about the quantity. It was about, this is what I'm used to, or this is how I prefer to consume this particular thing. So it's funny because you always got to let the kid tell you. Claire, the example that I use is you go to a restaurant maybe and you order a steak, and you would be really disappointed if somebody brought you a bite of a steak, but you'd also be really disappointed if somebody brought you a side of beef, because there's a size in the middle that is the right size in order to make this consumable.
As a non-beef eater, I'd probably be unhappy with the regular steak too. Yeah, I think one of the really important things about this is, and I'm not sure how often this gets taught in the context of preference assessments, but when we're selecting these reinforcers for our clients, I think it's really important for us to match our preference assessment procedures to the magnitude at which that reinforcer will be used, right? So I work with teachers sometimes who are pretty savvy folks, and they're running things akin to MSWO procedures, maybe because that's what they've been taught in a workshop. And then they want to use those reinforcers during a 15-minute free play period. And you have to sometimes say to the teacher, like, well, the highest preferred thing when you're dealing with 30 seconds of access to this reinforcer in an MSWO may not support behavior when the access duration is 15 minutes. And that has been shown in studies before the ones that we've been talking about today. But I think sometimes that's a little snippet that gets overlooked.
Yeah. And there's also some different ways of talking about magnitude, and they may not all be the same thing. And Willie, I was really cued in when you talked about, at what point do those kids discriminate that magnitudes are different, and you use, discrete edible items and be in that regard quantifying magnitude as a difference in count or a difference in size. Yeah. But we often also talk about magnitude as a difference in duration. And there may be differences in individuals' ability to discriminate things of different duration.
Oh, for sure.
Where can you tell that 30 seconds is different than a minute, which is very different than when you've got those discriminative stimuli in front of you of like 1 versus 3 Skittles or steaks or whatever it is.
And those durations might not be static either. So if you think back to the video game example, right? Like the beauty of what video game programmers have figured out about reinforcement is there's escalating response requirements to complete a level, right? So it might not even be that it's 2 minutes of access that's the sweet spot. It's like, well, whatever it takes for me to finish this level, which might start at 30 seconds early on in the game. And then, by the time you're at level 462 or whatever level my husband's on half the games he plays, that's now taking you 45 minutes to get through that level. And that's now where your sweet spot is.
I have to concur with that. I have 2 middle school boys, and one of them in particular, whether it's Madden or Fortnite, there's they would not be happy with even 5 minutes of access to it. That would be insufficiently reinforcing. And you're absolutely right. Those game designers are in their own right masters of behavior analysis, because they certainly are able to program for prolonged engagement. So yes, I live that firsthand, especially like when it's time to come up for dinner, and it's, okay, you gotta, but I'm in the middle of my round, and there's no, you can't press pause. There's no pausing it. This is all the, so there's consequence. There's punishment for leaving early. There's also, it's amazing.
But that actually shows up, exemplifies another interesting feature of that arrangement, is that the value, if you will, diminishes immediately after your guy dies. So in your case, dinner is insufficient to compete with my game under conditions in which I'm getting to the end of it. However, as soon as my guy dies or the game is over, then dinner will compete with my starting a new one. So there's a very dynamic sort of feature or quality to how valuable something is.
Yeah, very much so. So I want to get into some of the replications here, since we have Jeff and Claire here to talk about their replications as well. But before we leave your article, obviously not just your article, you have numerous co-authors. Are there any concluding thoughts on those particular studies in that article, Willie?
No, I think, there were interesting findings. They were sometimes unexpected. People, it seemed to strike a nerve because people started people are doing all kinds of research that now extends that now. And, obviously, Jeff's paper and Claire's paper, or the papers in their labs, are two of the finest kind of extensions, but there's dozens now. People kind of like jumped on this. It's like, hey, wait a minute, is this real? And there's some really interesting ones in that have moved on to things like acquisition. There's a couple of acquisition studies. Well, does it matter? Does the kid learn better under these conditions? Who cares if they prefer it? Is it beneficial for the child? And I think what that exemplifies is the value of individualized learning arrangements. That is, for some kids this matters. For some kids it does not. But maybe we should invest some time in figuring out what are the parameters of instructional arrangement that actually matter to a child, and then arranging those features throughout our instructional experience, so that we can maximize our time with them. But this is one of those things.
All right.
So
Jeff,
one of the... Oh, I'm sorry, Matt. One of the interesting things I think about Willie's paper is, he put it as it struck a nerve. But I think, one of the interesting things is that there are lots of labs that have kind of independently embarked. Like Willie published his paper, and that subsequent to that have independently undertaken studies that have looked at replications. So Jeff and I talk fairly frequently. We're good friends, but I don't know that either of us knew necessarily that we were both doing accumulated distributed replications until we showed up at a conference. And I was like, wait, hey, we're doing that too. And I think we're seeing that across lots of the replications. So you're seeing a lot of this work now coming out kind of in 2018, 2019, 2020, which is kind of what the lag is from something being published to being able to do a replication and then get that published. And I think that says volumes about Willie's research, because that's the kind of study, that we all really want to do, that a bunch of other authors pick up and find interesting and relevant across populations and settings and kinds of responses, and, regardless of what it is we're doing. So hats off to Willie on that one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We should give some credit to Dan Feenup here, because Dan was doing this stuff before. I think he talked about it a little differently, and he was facing a kind of a different question. In fact, he talked about it in terms of fluent versus disfluent work schedules, and sort of attributed the effects to people wanting to work continuously rather than have their work interrupted. Which is also what happens when you're talking about accumulated versus distributed. But his initial work on that had come out 3 years before the 2014 paper. So, it wasn't like we were the first ones in this field. But.
Well, and Dan's work built on a bunch of other work too. So no, I mean, it's not like any of this comes out of the dark. I do think that in this era of working from home, and this is something that Matt kind of mentioned to us in an email before the show, I think we're all learning the net effects of frequent interruptions on work productivity and getting things done. The extent to which, when you have 1,000 competing demands that are pinging you constantly and not your normal workspace and work routines, that kind of is disruptive to the rate at which you can accomplish tasks that lead to meaningful reinforcers.
That's right. Between children and dogs, I think it's, and cats jumping into your lap and things along those lines. So, so that's Feenup et al. 2011. I think that's the paper that I saw in your reference list. Willie.
Yeah.
So I'll put a note of that in the show notes for today's episode as well.
But even before that, several basic researchers have been looking at this question of accumulation and under what conditions will an organism, accumulate a quantity of reinforcers before consuming them. So people have looked at things like travel costs or work requirements. So there was a rich basic literature on the topic as well.
Unquestionably. All right, so let's get into some of these extensions. Claire, I want to save yours for last because it's at least in terms of setting and participants and things like that, it's different. So I want to reserve that because I want to draw a little bit more, contrast. So Jeff, why don't you take some time here and talk about your follow-up study, I suppose, or to Willie's. What was different about it? What were there other questions you were trying to answer? What extensions were you trying to make from these earlier findings? So I'll leave it to you to take it away from there.
Yeah. So one of the things we do in my program to try and help everybody, keep up with the current literature, because you get working and you get busy, and it's hard to carve out time to make sure that you're staying up to date on what's current. Is we set up a weekly reading group. So we pull one article from JABA every week and we read it as a group and discuss it. And it kind of sets a nice social contingency to get us engaged and continuing to stay engaged with our literature. And that's where we came across this paper the first time, was in one of those reading groups. And again, I was very, very pleasantly taken aback by it, is that we feel at this point like we know so much about behavior that when you see something that really shocks and surprises you, that gets me very excited. It's I need to know more about this. I need to understand this better. And in a lot of ways, the study I really do want to emphasize the role of the graduate students who took the lead on this one, particularly Hannah Meitzen and Caitlin Fulton. In a lot of ways, we were calling BS on Willie's results, is particularly in the context of working with kids with more severe problem behavior, but especially those for whom we know the presentation of instructions is an aversive event that evokes problem behavior. The idea that, yes, accumulated reinforcement may be a preferred consequence, but that also involves the immediate accumulation of additional work. So the idea of presenting more work early on to get a delayed consequence, our expectation was that if we did that, we were going to start seeing a lot more problem behavior, that the reinforcer might be more valuable, but the initial consequence of exposure to this is there's going to be a lot more work involved. So for kids for whom you've identified that they do have what we consider to be escape-maintained problem behavior, usually we start intervention is to arrange a pretty rich schedule of reinforcement. So, we might ask them to complete one task, and then we deliver reinforcement for completing that one task. So, if it's doing academic work, complete one academic task and then get access to a break with some preferred activity for, a brief period, like 30 seconds, which, yes, it's weird. But the idea is it keeps the work period brief, so it's not a horribly aversive situation. It allows you to essentially create mass trials where you can frequently associate compliance with the access to reinforcement. And, ideally, maybe it also starts associating instruction with positive reinforcement, and then it's not so bad. And then from there, once you've started establishing compliance as a replacement for problem behavior, then we work to build up very gradually, often through demand fading, to ultimately kind of build tolerance for these longer instructional procedures. And we thought, wait, if we're going to jump to kind of that terminal point at the very end, like we've seen what that looks like, there's going to be beatings involved. So a lot of the ways, if you look through our study, this was set up in I expect this to fail miserably kind of way. So after establishing a baseline, we kind of expose kids to our standard differential reinforcement of compliance, which is this, what we're now calling a distributed work and reinforcement arrangement. Initially saw a good treatment effect and then put in accumulated. We expected that to just blow up in problem behavior and show we had to go back and then gradually fade to get kids there. And we were kind of pleasantly shocked when that didn't happen. is we saw no disruption of problem behavior for that first kid. We're like, well, isn't that surprising? So then we said, all right, well, let's keep going with this replication and see under what, which condition does the kid actually prefer. That was our first participant, and he actually still preferred the distributed condition. But we had that data set, and we just kind of sat on it for a little while, waiting for, these were all done in the context of clinical interventions for the kids to our clinic. And then it was actually a couple years later when we had our next group of kids come in, and it was kids for whom differential reinforcement of compliance did not initially work. That it looked like it did. We got some treatment effects, but they were inconsistent, and we started seeing more and more problem behavior. And I was like, we could try that accumulated reinforcement thing and think if that helps. And it was probably one of my favorite moments of ever being an advisor, because my grad student, Caitlin Fulton at the time, these were not small hitters, we'll say. Like, each of these kids were pretty significant in terms of the problem behavior they were engaging in. And she was, she was struggling. There's a good amount of problem behavior going on. And my solution was, well, why don't you ask them to engage in longer periods of work to earn reinforcement? And I cannot characterize the death eyes that she gave me. Like, I can't believe you're even going to ask me to go do this. And I was like, just trust me on this one. Let's give it a shot. And she did, and it worked remarkably well. That we thought it would make things worse going into this. But arranging these accumulated conditions, we actually saw pretty substantial reductions in the occurrence of problem behavior. We saw increases in compliance. And for at least one of the three participants, a demonstrated preference for those conditions. So that is the reason I got so kind of excited about this. We keep getting these unexpected outcomes out of this, that there does seem to be this counterintuitive big bump associated with earning access to larger, ours used duration as well, but longer durations of access to reinforcement seems to really add something as a big punch to our interventions. And I know one of the hardest things we always deal with is, how do we maintain the value of our reinforcers over time? And this seems like in a way of increasing the value of those reinforcers and ultimately making us better as clinicians, more effective as clinicians.
So why do you think it was successful, especially given the death eyes, I guess, that you received? So it sounds like Caitlin knew these participants well, and was predicting an outcome that was going to be pretty unsuccessful. What's your take on why this did work out in the way it did?
I'm going to give the classic academic answer of, I don't know, but there's a bunch of possible explanations that we can come up with. That's where we get excited about what are the next questions that we get to ask. But one of the ways that it may have been effective, obviously, is that you're delivering a much more powerful reinforcer, or however you want to qualify that or quantify that, but you're delivering a more powerful reinforcer, and thus you're more effectively strengthening compliance, which theoretically is incompatible with problem behavior. Or it may be that through this lengthier reinforcement period, you're getting a longer, essentially what we call an abolishing operation period, or a longer period in which instructions aren't being delivered. So maybe then those instructional periods aren't so bad simply by spacing them out, as opposed to having the frequent presentation of those instructional periods under distributed conditions. Or it may be that by associating instruction with these longer reinforcement periods, again, it's impacting. Rob Horner published some papers in the 80s that he described as neutralizing routines. But the idea of instruction is aversive, but by associating that with more preferred conditions, that those may become less aversive over time. So it may simply be that essentially the instruction wasn't, it sucked a little bit less. So kids may have been less motivated to escape from it because it was associated with these more preferred periods. Those are, again, lengthy, long-winded, academic-y type answer, but we don't know. And that's what's so cool about this to me, is we've got a lot more work to still figure this out.
I see. Yeah. Well, I appreciate, it's funny. Sometimes we don't hear the words "I don't know" frequently enough. And so I commend you for being candid in that, noting that, some of these things are speculation. But interesting findings, certainly. So
Matt, can I hop in?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the things that I think links to Jeff's second speculative point is that there's also evidence that organisms, including children, pigeons, rats, find transitions between rich reinforcement contexts and lean reinforcement contexts aversive. And so one of the possibilities is that by using a distributed arrangement, you're increasing the number of kind of rich lean transitions within an environment. So you're making it such that your child has to go back and forth between things that they like and things that they don't like. And that might actually make your instructional context more aversive in some ways. So I don't know that we've got really great data about that in the context of accumulated and distributed arrangements, but there's some pretty compelling data, both for, like I said, in the EAB literature and mixed data in the applied literature, suggesting that those rich lean transitions can really muck things up.
Yeah, I thought of something similar with regard to Jeff's paper, that I wondered if some of the effect wasn't as Claire suggested, a continuously positive hedonic sequence. That is, I get all the bad stuff out of the way first and then get to enjoy all the good stuff afterwards. And that's kind of how it got arranged in Jeff's treatment study, is that, the kid works for 3.5 minutes and then the rest of that session time is all gravy, right? But in a distributed condition, it's like, oh, I got to go back to work every few seconds, but maybe if I can get out of the way first, I don't mind as much, which makes a lot of contact. In fact, with the way that Dan Fino had described it initially, is a preference for that continuous work arrangement.
Willie, was it your paper that used the term handling costs?
Yeah, it was. Handling costs.
I love that term, by the way. I thought it was terrific.
Well, it is. I find myself in retrospect wondering whether we were wise to choose it. Handling costs is something that we had actually borrowed from the behavioral economics literature, and who in fact had borrowed it from the foraging literature. But in this context, it really just is the amount of it's the time, really. It's a temporal parameter required to process the reinforcer, handle and prepare the reinforcer for consumption, right? And so we were looking for reasons to explain why you get higher response rates. So it makes a lot more sense in other contexts. For example, in the economic literature, you can go back to a real close study by Greg Madden that introduced this concept in terms of the cost or how much a person would pay for puffs on a cigarette. And the point in that study that was made about handling costs, well, if what you're doing is taking a cigarette out of a pack of cigarettes and taking one versus 20 puffs on it, the amount of time that you have to spend taking that cigarette out of the pack in the first place is the same regardless, right? And we sort of translated it into this context. You can think of it in terms of the time it took to orient to the reinforcer, receive that reinforcer, and then once the work is done, return back, or once the reinforcer is consumed, return back to that work. And those are little bitty, chunks of time that may accumulate, which we thought might account for why, on average, the work was slower during the distributed condition. But the whole point of handling costs is that they remain roughly constant, independent of the size of the reinforcer. So the time is the same regardless of whether you're consuming one large or accumulated quantity of reinforcer or one small or distributed reinforcer. But in a distributed arrangement, you have to pay those costs each time, right? And so they tend to pile up. Whereas in an accumulated reinforcement arrangement or with one large reinforcer, you only pay it once. And so it detracts less from the time that you can actually be working on the task. That's the story behind that.
Very cool. I just thought it was a neat term, and it certainly, from my perspective, summed up that problem nicely. So, Claire, I want to get to the Robinson St. Peter paper. Just want to make sure, Jeff, do you have anything you want to add about that your study before we move on? We can come back to it certainly also.
I'm good.
All right. So, Claire, what I loved about your paper is that you worked with what I like to consider my kind of people, and it was done in a classroom setting, and there are a whole host of things that certainly resonate with me. And so, rather than me continue to describe your study, I'll get out of the way and let you talk about the study itself and what you're trying to do in the setting, participants, etc.
Yeah, so my kind of people are your kind of people, Matt. So I do a lot of my work in classrooms, and in particular, we were pretty heavily involved in alternative education and special education for children who have been identified as kind of oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. So these are highly verbally functioning kids. They teach me words. Not always words that you can repeat on a podcast.
I don't want to put the explicit tag on this.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So we're not dealing with your typical kind of ASD population, and we were dealing with a lot of forms of problem behavior. So one of the things that Jeff measured in his study, and as I mentioned earlier, Jeff and I kind of undertook these two lines of research almost at the same time and independently of each other. And so Jeff measured problem behavior, but that was really what we wanted to do. We wanted to take this population that is characterized by high frequency, high intensity, challenging behavior, and see if we could make these accumulated distributed arrangements pan out like Willie did within a classroom context. So we worked with 3 boys who were being served in an alternative education center. All 3 of them had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Actually 2 boys and a girl. All of them had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and a variety of other comorbid disorders. All of them had age-typical verbal skills. So these are your kids that are, in trouble for calling you names, and they all had a history of really severe forms of challenging behavior. Nicole Robinson Brown and I went down this path. This was her master's project. And because we were actually having trouble clinically with Harmony, who's one of the participants in the paper, her forms of challenging behavior were really severe in that she had a trauma history with a particular history of sexual abuse, and her problem behavior often manifested in the form of sexually assaulting others. So this is a big deal in a classroom, and was part of the reason that Harmony had been removed from a traditional classroom environment and into an alternative education environment. And we were just trying to find ways to get her to work within the classroom. It seemed like problem behavior was evoked both by restricted access to preferred tangibles, denied NANs, non-preferred work. So one of these situations that's really hard to deal with because there's lots of different evocative situations. And what was being asked of the students in the classroom, and this is a classroom that involves some fluency-based instruction. So for the precision teaching crowd that's out there, I know, Matt, you've done a handful of episodes talking with precision teachers and standard acceleration charters. This is a classroom that had some instruction that was delivered in that way. So we wanted to extend what Willie did to these contexts where we were doing 3-minute fluency timings with the kids on academic skills, and essentially wanted to see what happened if we paused everything in the middle of the 3 minutes. So we stopped the 3 minutes, delivered the reinforcer, or if we let the 3 minutes run and let them accumulate reinforcers. So one of the things that's different about the way that our study was arranged and the way that both Willie and Jeff's studies were arranged is that our exchange requirement was different. So in our study, in the accumulated condition, instead of a certain number of responses to produce exchange, our students worked for 3 minutes. And then what changed was the magnitude of the reinforcer at the end of that period of time. So based on how much work they did, then they would earn that amount of reinforcement, right? So 15 seconds times the number of problems that they did. So the work period was constant, and then the reinforcer duration and the accumulated condition varied. Now, the other thing that varies is our outcomes. And we're in the classroom. So we're doing this in the classroom. This is during a fluency station in the classroom. So the mayhem of an alternative education classroom is happening behind us. And in fact, we submitted this. Nicole and I had a really long conversation about whether or not we should even submit this to JABA if JABA was to write home for it, because our data are messy. They're like the kind of messy that you get when an alternative education classroom is happening behind you.
When you were describing those characteristics in the paper, or when both of you were described those characteristics in the paper, I was laughing because I could certainly just picture the mayhem and trying to collect someone's master's data during that. It's just there's some good stories here. So particularly in our control conditions, we had a control that was a no reinforcement control, just to make sure that the kids weren't just compliant. We had a good sense that they weren't just compliant, but just to make sure. And in the control condition, we put the control condition out, the kids would say like, this one, I'm not going to do anything for this one. And then they would turn around and engage in instruction with the rest of the class, or like figure out what peer they were going to holler at that day. So it was really interesting. Also interesting, kind of a side story and we mentioned this in the paper, during the concurrent chain evaluation where they could choose, we restricted their most preferred at one point. And when we did that for one of our participants, so all the work was exactly the same across all the conditions, exactly the same work, simple addition problems. And when it got so that he didn't have the option to work for his preferred arrangement, he threw the cards, screamed, "This is way too hard." I'm like, dude, this is exactly the same work that you just did 3 minutes ago. And like went into full blown meltdown. But it was interesting to see what the kids had to say about the conditions, just as an aside. Anyway, we find things that are slightly different for these 3 participants. So I guess I should also note our participants are just working. So there's no tokens, there's no signal of how much they've accumulated as they go. So for all of our participants, the accumulated condition resulted in the highest rates of work completion during the work period. So they completed more problems in the accumulated condition. But they didn't necessarily prefer the accumulated condition. So 2 of our 3 participants actually preferred the distributed arrangement to the accumulated arrangement, which means that they selected a condition that resulted in less access to reinforcement overall. So if you look at this from a very molar level of like, how much reinforcement did you earn during this independent workstation? They were earning less reinforcement based on their choice than they would have if they had chosen the accumulated condition. So we found that really, really surprising. And I'll echo Jeff's humility and say, I don't know. Like, I don't know why that is necessarily. All 3 of our studies are dealing with kids who have diagnoses that are associated with impulsivity. I don't know if it's the access to the other reinforcers in the classroom that were behind these kids that might have impacted choosing to work for the distributed. I don't know if it has to do with the function of their behavior. So my guess is that we had some multiple control. My guess is that we had some tangibly maintained behavior. And I don't know if there's something about tangible functions of like, give me the thing that impacts behavior differently. I think these are all really interesting questions that would be fodder for future research in this area. Was there any qualitative observations, like, so like they got the thing and then it sounds like they were trying to attend to what else was going on in the classroom. And so I guess one question I would have is, if you had the proverbial treatment room, with fewer distractions, would you see different results as a function of that changed environment?
I certainly think we would have seen less variability, right? So we were, although maybe, I mean, that's just my guess. Although if you look across the 3 papers, all 3 papers have a fair bit of variability in the data from session to session, from phase to phase. So I say that as my gut of, well, yeah, if you had a more controlled environment, you'd be able to isolate more variables. But even in more controlled environments, I think we see a fair bit of variability. I do think we didn't collect data on how engaging the instruction was. Like, was the teacher doing something really cool on the smartboard that day? Or was another student in crisis in the classroom on that day? We don't have those data, so I can't say definitively, like, yep, that impacted behavior. But I will say that, yep, it certainly looked like that impacted behavior. If there was another student screaming bloody murder in one part of the classroom and our poor kids over there trying to rattle off math addition facts on flashcards, it did seem to reduce response rates. It would be an interesting evaluation. I think part of the barrier to that practically for us is that we work in schools that are overcrowded. And so the extent to which we ever have access to a totally isolated room with nothing else going on is pretty limited, unless we're working like in the principal's office, and that has its own set of confounding variables associated with it. So sometimes those evaluations are a little hard to practically pull off.
Oh, of course. Yeah. That was more of a thought experiment, I suppose, than anything else. Jeffrey, you see you want to jump in here?
One of the shared features of all of these studies was the inclusion of the preference assessment at the end of it. And in some extent, it gives us an opportunity to figure out, like, what is the particular feature or mechanism at play and how does that impact preference. But there's also a very clinically or educationally relevant aspect to that is, for me, with kids with escape maintain problem behavior, we had a baseline condition in there, in that you can have no intervention in place, or you can choose to engage in intervention in which the child is now selecting to do work. And for at least 2 out of our 3 kids, it said that these conditions produced conditions where kids with pretty significant problem behavior were choosing to engage in prosocial behavior when given that option, as opposed to having problem behavior be reinforced. In Claire's study, it's these kids with significant behavioral issues are choosing to participate in work amidst the distractions of everything else going on in the class. That is a strong measure of potentially not only effective, but also socially valid interventions, that the kids are demonstrating a preference for engaging in these activities. And the relevant or relative social validity between accumulated and distributed are what's likely to get the kid to jump in and actively participate in making sure that we're giving our participants or clients, whatever we want to call them, that active voice in deciding whether or not they're going to participate that day. And if we're not necessarily getting the preferences that we would like for ourselves, so we had one kid for whom there was preference for the distributed condition. It's we say, okay, now what do we need to do to stack the deck in favor? Like, as a teacher, I would much rather be able to sit and teach a kid for 3 or 4 minutes consecutively and give them a break, where I can then go do something else. As a teacher, that's going to make me much more efficient than do a task, get a break, do a task, get a break. So we took that as how do we modify this? How do we get them to start choosing a more accumulated like condition? Or for another one of our participants who basically demonstrated no preference, we took the same thing of how do we stack the deck in favor of them choosing to start engaging in academic work? So not forcing them into it, not like, nope, we're just going to work right through this and keep doing it anyway. But how do we use those preference assessment results as a baseline to influence making good, healthy choices for themselves? And again, especially given the complex environment that Claire's kids were working in, the fact that you get anybody choosing to engage in academic work, given all the other really fun crap that might be going around, is pretty awesome outcome.
Yeah,
That's a
and
good point.
our kids never picked the control condition. So I think that's, although our preferences across the two reinforcement conditions were somewhat mixed, they could have said, nah, not working for you today, right? Like this is the one that I'm just going to pick the control set. And instead, again, they never picked it. And when it came down to picking between the two less preferred options, they would make statements about, well, like, at least I'm going to get something here, like, all right, well, I'll do this one because this one's no good, so they definitely were engaged with instruction and willing to hang in there in environments that were sometimes beautiful, quiet, happily, effectively working classrooms, and sometimes were not.
So I want to bring up a question, and we were talking about this before we hit record, but I want to let the listeners know that Claire put together this summary of all three papers that was just outstanding. And one of the questions that you raised in that is the influence of verbal repertoires on the choice making of the participants across all three studies. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more in terms of, how that might have influenced choice making?
So I will say that in all three of our studies, and at least two of the follow-up studies, and maybe Willie, you would know if there's outliers here, all of our participants, regardless of diagnosis, had some level of verbal capability and probably some rule governance. And so it's possible that there's a role of rule governance in here somewhere. Willie?
Yeah, I don't know the distribution of the kind of samples used in other studies. I've noticed that in these, they tended to be individuals with fairly intact verbal repertoires. But I think there's definitely a role if you consider some of the other questions that are being asked here. Again, going back to Dan Phenum's work, if what we're talking about is someone that has a preference for fluent work schedules, this is a choice of an individual that has made rules to themselves about how they would like to earn their reinforcers, and it may not necessarily be about the verbal abilities, but perhaps some of the cognitive abilities that tend to correlate with those verbal abilities. The sort of person that makes rules about what they do, why they do what they do, may definitely respond differently given these sorts of choices than people that lack those kinds of abilities. But I think that's true of a lot of areas that we investigate. I think that's true of many of the efforts that I've made in my career to try to do, translational research. And in an odd way, I think that having that ability to develop rules about why you do what you do sometimes gets in the way. I think it lends itself to the sorts of irrational choices and suboptimal responses that many of our brethren in the more mainstream behavioral economics literature look at. In a weird way, I think that kids that don't have those abilities, that maybe aren't as verbally intact or as, aren't operating under those kinds of cognitive levels, I think they might be less susceptible to irrational choices based upon the rules that they make for themselves. It's a thing I've been wanting to explore for a long time. But
that's a fair point for sure. So I know we're coming up on our allotted time here, so I want to kind of wrap this up. And as we talked about before we got underway here, is I want to kind of extract any suggestions, food for thought lessons geared towards the everyday BCBA, someone who is wrestling with issues of cooperation, of trying to arrange effective reinforcement schedules, etc. So, what would be some take-home points that you guys could suggest for folks who are listening to this show?
If I could offer one, is to look beyond the boundaries of these three papers, because people have taken this in interesting directions that I'm particularly interested in what people have done in the context of acquisition. Again, it's that question of, we've got preferences, we've got response rates, but does it matter for these kids? But there's some very nice studies out there that say, yes, it matters. In fact, kids learn more rapidly, master tasks more rapidly under these conditions. There's a really nice study that was put out last year, 2018, I want to say, in a Journal of Behavioral Education. It was, in fact, Michelle Frank Crawford's dissertation. And, Michelle was one of the individuals that was with me on the original study. But that's, in essence, what she showed. In the majority of learners, they're actually making faster progress in meeting their mastery targets in the accumulated condition. So if you're out there and interested in improving the efficiency of your learning, maybe that's a thing to look up.
And that's Frank Crawford, 2018 Journal of Behavioral Education?
Yes, that's correct.
Awesome.
Shout out to Michelle.
All right, very good. Very good. Claire or Jeff?
Yeah, I'll say kind of one of my speculative takeaways from this, and I think Willie articulated at the very beginning of this, is it's probably not best to chop up our potential reinforcers in really odd ways. So the traditional 30 seconds access to a particular reinforcer is probably an artifact of trying to standardize things and standardize procedures for research, but in practice, there's a natural point of fracture that we could probably identify of when something will and won't serve as a reinforcer. And that, if I had to guess, that probably is one of the major takeaways for this is don't mess up something that would otherwise work by chopping it up into a weird shape.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think too, to emphasize that we should, when we have procedures that are probably equally effective or close to equally effective, allow our learners to have choices about how they want the environment to be arranged. So across the papers, and Willie did a good summary of this as part of a discussion that he did last year at ABAI. And I think, Willie, if I remember correctly, it's about 2/3 across the literature of folks prefer accumulated reinforcers, and those work better for about 2/3 of people across studies.
Yeah, I think it was, well, I looked at it just the other day. Yeah, it was 2/3 in terms of preference across studies. And now the number is, it's in the 30s somewhere of total subjects exposed to these comparisons. And it was about 2/3 about efficiency, in fact. But when you looked at, is it more effective in terms of things like acquisition or accuracy? It jumped up to like 3/4. So yeah, you're about right.
Yeah, so I think, if you're working with a learner where you think, gosh, a accumulated arrangement there might be some advantages, but I'm not hard pressed about it. I'm doing one-to-one sessions with this learner. I really could do it whatever way I wanted to. I think giving the learner some choice, and both Jeff and Willie have done really good work in the area of choice and decision making with kids historically as well. Giving our learners some choice about how they want those to be arranged is probably ideal, because it's like everything else in behavior analysis and related to our use of reinforcers, it's probably individualized a little bit.
Very good.
Absolutely.
All right. This has been a fun topic to chat about, guys. I really appreciate you guys taking the time. Willie, it's great to have you on the podcast. Long overdue, sure. I should add also. Jeff and Claire, thanks for broaching this as a topic and making the arrangements. So, all right, folks, we'll see you in the in the JABA Inside Series number 4. So until then, we'll talk to you later.
All right, thanks a lot, man.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.